Okay, so today we're going to be covering quite a few things. Topics of the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s, the movie Carol by Todd Haynes, and a little bit about an AIDS activist, lesbian, Cindy Patton. And some of the topics we're going to be talking about is heteronormativity, reframing history, and the use of color as a film device. So a little bit about the movie Carol before I move on. It was one of the last films by Todd Haynes, which is a new queer cinema director. A great, beautiful film with lots of color, very rich, starring Kate Blanchett and Mara Sweeney. It's set in the 1950s. It's about two lesbians. It's a love story. Obviously, the 1950s were repressive. You know, the idea of being an openly homosexual person was unheard of in the 1950s. And I'm going to get into a little bit about the history. But the movie is about a lesbian couple that meet. Kate Blanchett's character, Carol, who the movie is about, is married. She does have a kid. The other character is dating another guy, and they somehow meet in a department store, and a love affair ensues. Obviously, undercover and quiet and under wraps. But it's a very quiet film, beautifully shot, very well acted, and it's very much in line with Far From Heaven, Todd Haynes' other film, about like repression, kind of that same 1950s feel of the inability to be able to express yourself and to accept your own sexuality. So yeah, that's just a little bit about the background of the film. I'm going to move on. All right. So I do want to tell you a little bit about what was happening during the 1950s, just to get like some context going on. So after 1945, World War II, we had like kind of the post-war boom. Economy was going up. It's the beginning of the Cold War. Because it was the Cold War, we had this idea of like, how do you make the best society? You make the best society by having that nuclear family, which is kind of like Cold War related. And that was just an example. I think the nuclear family is a perfect example of heteronormativity, right? You have the heterosexual husband, you have the heterosexual woman, you have the two kids, the car, the picket fence, the nice house. We had the economic boom, so everybody was doing well. This was also a time where we gave birth to the largest generation, which would then become the baby boomers. And so, you have lots of women who were either mothers or wives. They were giving birth at this time because they were, spending money and having family and having kids because America was productive at this time. And you had shows like Leave It to Beaver, which promoted domesticity and, this idea that as a woman, you stay home and you take care of the kids and you go shopping and you buy groceries, and then the men they're off, making money. And so I'm going to show you a little bit of a clip. This is not from the film. This is actually a pretty interesting breakdown, a little bit of background about the movie Carol that I wanted you guys to see. Go ahead and start that.
Tone and atmosphere.
Okay.
So The Price of Salt was for many years the only lesbian novel in either hard or soft cover with a happy ending. Do you think that's part of its success?
Well, I didn't know that. I thought there were all those pulpy novels.
Yeah, but they end up dead or crazy.
Do they all?
Apparently, according to one of these literary researchers, said that.
I find it extraordinary that it was Highsmith who managed that.
In 2016, 1 year after Carol was released, BFI's Flair Festival named Carol as the best LGBT film of all time. Naturally, this provoked debate. Why was Carol rated above other classic LGBT films, many of which didn't even make the list? films that are more provocative or counterculture, films that were more influential in queer culture or beyond. Now, the title of Best LGBT Film is an accolade I don't think it's fair to burden any film with. There should be space on the pedestal for more than just one. Nevertheless, Carol is by no means undeserving of its place as a paragon of the genre. It is a story inspired by real gay experiences, based on real gay people the author knew. It was written by a gay woman, adapted by a gay woman, and directed by a gay man. It took 18 years to get this film made, not only because it was difficult to fund a gay film, though it was, not only because it was difficult to gain support for a film with 2 female leads, though it was, but primarily, perhaps, it was because this story is unapologetically queer, and Naj resisted executive attempts to change that.
The other thing that was always resisted was the notion that one or both of the women had to suffer in some way, or feel great guilt about their sexuality. What was refreshing about the book by Pat, the Queen of Guilt, is there is not that in The Price of Salt.
In a world where queer stories frequently end in tragedy, often involving shame, self-denial, or penance, Carol is a rare exception. The attraction these characters feel for one another is never questioned, never deconstructed, never moralized, never explained. It just is. Carol is a film that exists in the moment. The custody hearing scene may not have been in the novel, but it certainly feels like it could have been. Naj didn't invent it whole cloth, but filtered pieces of the novel through her own reading of the characters, and presented the result in a style evocative of the original. Even though Naj has shone light on things the book prefers to keep ambiguous, the scene still ends with that same sense of uncertainty. From Harge's face, it seems Carol's words have had an impact on him, but we don't find out if he accepted her terms. The film suggests they've come to some agreement.
Have you seen Ring? Once or twice.
But doesn't care to explain any more than this, leaving us to figure out for ourselves what it means. The film itself ends the same way. We don't know what the future holds for Carol and Therese. Will Therese move in with her? Will Carol keep seeing her daughter? Will they be happy in the end? Or will their life be beset with the same struggles we've already seen? These questions don't matter. All that matters is right now, in this moment. They love each other. Carol succeeds as a film and as an adaptation because it knows the details are not important. What is important is how they made you feel.
Yeah, so if you haven't seen that film already, I definitely recommend it. But this is not a film review. This is kind of a breakdown. So I think what's really amazing was that this film was made by queer women and men, but that it was based on queer women and men, and directed by a man, a gay man. And so I think that makes it a special piece. And I think what was interesting is how important the love story is, and how unimportant the morality piece of it all is. Although you understand there's repression, and you understand that at that time that gay men or lesbians were not allowed to openly talk or refer to themselves as that. And so there is morality in the background, but it's not about that. It's a very present film about these two women and this love story. That what was great was that it was a film where lesbians were not subject to the male gaze. It wasn't about the sex. It wasn't about how beautiful they were, although they're very beautiful, but it was about the love story between the two of them. And let me get to the next slide. So I love this quote. In the silence and stillness, they use color like body language and windows to convey what's hidden on the surface, which is paramount for a story set at a time when lesbians couldn't speak plainly about their love. So that's very true. Like I had said, this movie is kind of quiet. At Todd Haynes's films, at least to me, like Far From Heaven and this one, they're quieter, not like Velvet Goldmine, which is intense and it's a rock star film. But Far From Heaven and this film are both kind of subdued in their in in how the narrative moves along. Um, there's no killings, there's no huge fights, there's no battle scenes, there's no crazy drunken fest. It's really about the kind of like restrictive, oppressive time that the 1950s were. And I think that this film is really good because it uses color like Far From Heaven to kind of talk about what's under the surface. Um, the color pops so much because there's a lot that these women can express publicly and they're too afraid to express in general. And so I think the director chooses to use color as a way to express the love between these women metaphorically. You can see that in their different styles of color that they use. And Kate Blanchett wears all these like kind of rose and reds and magentas because she's accepted that that she is this lesbian woman who can't say it, but she accepts her sexuality. At this point in the film, um, her husband knows that she's been with women. They're still married. They're going through a divorce. Um, it's known within that small group of that family, but she's kind of open about it. The other character, Therese, is just barely discovering this part of her. And so you can see it in the colors of the clothing scheme. It's darker browns, blacks, dark colors, dark hues. So the director really uses color to express the characters, who they are and what they are, and where, about their sexuality. And uses color. Interestingly enough, Todd Haynes decides to film this during Christmas time, which you're gonna have all your bright reds and your silvers. And what's really great is that I think for me, I think Christmas, and here's a great line: Christmas is the embodiment of heteronormativity and marketed towards the perfect nuclear family. Like, what perfect way to talk about that kind of 1950s feel of like the nuclear family, but to have it set at Christmas, right? With like the father, the mother, and the child, a Christmas tree and Christmas gifts. But in the background, or actually that's in the background, but in the forefront is their lives aren't working. They're not staying married. They're going to get divorced. And so it's all taking place around Christmas when Carol's decided not to spend Christmas with the family because they're getting divorced. So she feels like she should be alone, but she invites Therese and she has like a little Christmas time with her. And um, I think the director chose that specifically. It's all about time, not just in the year, but time frame. And their Price of Salt is the book that this was based on, that the screenplay was written about. And so that's why you heard that in that video clipping. Is The Price of Salt was the only book at that time that was written with a happy ending, a love story. And so I think it's special. And here's a picture of the husband who goes by Harge, and there's a scene between Harge and Carol where he's drunk and he's trying to get her to go with him to Christmas with the family, but she's staunchly in acceptance that she's not going to, and that this is what they need to do because she's accepted that she is this person, a lesbian. And so what Harge is going through is this idea that the nuclear family is being broken by her sexuality, her inability to conform to social pressure. The heteronormative ideal is that he brings her and the daughter to Christmas and they have a good time, and he provides and she takes, and it's like this like nuclear family ideal of the 1950s, domesticity and patriarchy. And I think this line, the threat of castration so intense that Harge seeks to destroy the threat, and the way he seeks to destroy the threat is after she decides not to, and she has this like little affair with Therese. He decides that he's going to sue for custody to get the daughter and voluntarily give the information that she is a lesbian or having an affair with these women. And you know, this is somebody he loves and who's the mother of his child, and yet he outs her, and she's forced to go to psychotherapy, in the 1950s. That's really frowned upon. And so um through this threat, he means to correct her otherness, the what they can't call lesbianism, and assert his sexual dominance, because he feels like if he can threaten her to change and become the woman that he wants, because he knows that she wants her daughter back, that this is a way for him to assert his dominance and his masculinity. Because if he doesn't have the wife and the child, and that image is ruined, then he's lost his masculinity, his desirability. He's no longer a man as far as society is concerned. And so this is definitely an example of the heteronormative ideal, how it's been smashed by this film. And he, throughout this film, is struggling with that. And I think that Todd Haynes tries to use this this actor who subtly is not in many parts. It's not really about him, but you really see him unravel. And there's even a point where he hires somebody to trick the two of them, and follows them, and then does this type of like Cold War spy operative hearing apparatus and on the other side of a wall of the hotel room, and listens in while the two women are finally having sex for the first time, and then sends the tape off to the lawyers and to Harge. And yeah, it's just it's intense when men get threatened, and that's what this film is about, is that their relationship threatens the fabric of society, so much so that he has to take her daughter away, which she absolutely loves. And so, that's a little bit about that heteronormative ideal and that oppressiveness, and how queer women and queer men were not allowed to express themselves. And so we fast forward now to the 1980s, right? So we leave the movie Carol in the 1950s, and now we get to the 1980s. And I just kind of want to set the scene. So again, what was happening in the 1980s? We had a Republican president elected, Ronald Reagan, the great communicator from California. And then, during this time in the background, from like starting in 79, we had something called the gay disease was creeping up. And finally in 81, the CDC identifies it as AIDS. And there's plenty of films that talk about this time and the gay disease. And you fast forward to 87, they had the DC March, because they didn't feel like Ronald Reagan really supported them, because he was silent about what was going on with the AIDS epidemic. So in 87, millions marched, 12 million people marched. And more money was, I think like 12 million or so dollars was given for AIDS research and AIDS support. And the reason why I bring up this timeline, because it wasn't until 1992 that the CDC finally redefined the AIDS definition to include women. So up until that point, it really only included men and the symptomology that surrounded what happened to men when they contracted HIV and died from AIDS and had AIDS. And so up to this point, women had not been included in that definition. So women could not get the same support, could not get the same resources, could not get the healthcare, could not get the housing. And so women were dying. And the reason I bring this up is because, up until this point, lesbian activism had been really heavily involved in the AIDS crisis. They showed up for their brothers, as they say. and that had kind of been neglected and not talked about. And so I just wanted to set up the scene of, like what was going on at that time. And there was an activist, Cindy Patton. I don't have a picture of her, but there's this great article that I found that includes this cover, Gays in the Crisis. And, she was kind of, one of those activists that wasn't really loved by many, because she pushed back against this idea that the AIDS crisis was all about saving the gay white male. And she said no, that there's more going on here, and that the cure to AIDS is not going to be it's a cure all, or like to cure everything. And so Cindy Patton is not out to discourage anyone from getting tested, although people said that they thought she was, but rather to encourage everybody to place less faith in the notion that there can be a simple scientific response to this epidemic that ignores the social repressions that make it a true crisis. So again, it's like this idea of repression going on. So yes, the government acknowledged that there was an AIDS epidemic, and it was willing to put money into AIDS research and to support people who had AIDS, but it wasn't willing to support holistically everything that was going on. It turned a blind eye to the fact that people were neglecting, gay men and women, and were actively marginalizing them as a result of having AIDS. Like people were completely like let go of their jobs. People were kicked out of their housing. That they were not allowed to go to school if they had it. It was a scare. Very similar to what's gone on sometimes with the pandemic, COVID-19, and which a lot of people do draw parallels to. And so, she was not well respected at the time. But what she was trying to say was that there were other ideals that we needed to also worry about on top of what was going with the AIDS epidemic. And it had to do with gay men and women being marginalized, not just because of the AIDS epidemic, but it allowed for the powers that be, heteronormativity, to then say, well, okay, well, we're only going to see you as this disease and nothing else. Otherwise, you don't exist. Right. And so it's this like kind of black and white thinking. It's like this binary thinking of either you have AIDS or you don't. And if you have AIDS, we'll give you money. Otherwise, we don't really care about you. And so she was trying to kind of promote that. And she was trying to say that, we are still oppressed. We're getting money, but we're still oppressed because you're not getting at you're trying to deal with the symptom, but you're not dealing with the problem. And so, so I think it's hard to connect Carol and Cindy Patton, but I think what's important is that Cindy Patton was speaking on a topic that during an epidemic is kind of forgotten about, which is like, what are our rights? What are we here for? What do we stand for? How do we help those who need help? And to not just be like blinded by language, because language from the mouth of the oppressor can seem very inviting. That's it.
Hi there, my name is Allie Walker, and I will be discussing the film Milk and Cronenberg in Queering the Political Audience. Gus Van Sant's Milk, 2008, follows the political story of Harvey Milk, who was the United States' first openly gay man elected to public office as a member of San Francisco's Board of Supervisors. Although the film is overall straight-washed and does not have the true essence of a queer film, the events the movie was based on were very impactful for American politics and queer history. In Joanne Laurier's article, Milk, Identity Politics, and Gus Van Sant's Art, she writes, quote, "Milk is consciously made, but it ends up, almost inevitably, in an unsavory political territory. While the director is no Democratic Party hack and not necessarily a particular fervent advocate of identity politics, a certain politics inevitably fills up the film's intellectual space." End quote. Although identity politics is a big theme within the film Milk, it is important to understand that Harvey Milk's identity as a gay man allowed for the pioneering of queer elected officials. Anne Cronenberg, LGBTQIA+ rights activist, Harvey Milk's campaign manager, and the founder of the Harvey Milk Foundation, has done a lot of amazing things to help empower the word and potential of Harvey Milk's story. Although Milk was assassinated before the AIDS crisis hit, many of the people who worked for Harvey and were mentored by him became LGBT and AIDS activists because they knew that is what Harvey would have done. Later in her political career, Anne Cronenberg became the executive director of the San Francisco Department of Emergency Management. During her time in public office, she has achieved many things, including advocating for increased federal funding during the AIDS epidemic and supported the San Francisco Board of Supervisors' efforts to argue cuts in AIDS and HIV federal funding, joined the campaign to purchase the Women's Building in San Francisco's Mission District, which advocates self-determination, gender equality, and social justice, and more. Lesbians during the AIDS epidemic were crucial because the male counterparts of their community were being affected, and many of them had to step up to leadership positions to combat the crisis. Many people do not know this because there's a sense of invisibility within the lesbian community. Gay men were always in the spotlight when it came to queer issues, especially during the AIDS epidemic. And lesbians were taking care of the men in the community when they were at their weakest. As a woman and a lesbian leader, we thank her for her countless hours and efforts to make this country a better place for queer people.
What can we as a community do to ensure that such visionaries stay alive? Well, I mean, I think it's in some, for me, it's about political climate. You began to speak about that. So I'm just throwing it out because this question is here and it's a meaningful one.
I mean, that's a big one. That's a huge question. I think it is changing the political climate, and it is continuing to move forward with equality and acceptance, and well, more than acceptance, the acknowledging the fact that we are all different, and that we have something to contribute. So, you know, it starts to me with education from a very young age, and I think that the way that we ensure that visionaries in the future are not taken from us too young is to start giving our young children the tools that they need to be able to go forward, and in the knowledge that we are all equal. And I think there should be curriculum in schools that deal with that from preschool, kindergarten on. I was talking to a few people at the reception beforehand about this. I think that, you know, the state, Mark Leno, sponsored that lesbian and gay curriculum be in the schools, but it doesn't exist. I mean, it's, you know, people are scrambling to put it together. I think that we need to teach people and show examples for people from a very young age, and that the only way society is going to change is one person at a time, through our example and through bringing our young people up.
Harvey Milk's biggest accomplishment was being a gay trailblazer for queer elected officials and political figures. Milk was the catalyst for queering the political audience. Laurier's article mentions, quote, Harvey Milk was a politician, and he operated in a big business party that would shift far to the right. He was without a doubt an honest and courageous individual and believed sincerely that all men are created equal. No matter how hard you try, you can never erase those words. However, his own middle-class position and the lack of genuine left-wing perspective left him firmly in the camp of liberal reformism. End quote. During the 1970s, the country as a whole shifted toward right-wing political values. Before starting his campaign, the film mentions that he was a Republican. We have to keep in mind that many people do not like to dive headfirst when it comes to changes. We are presented with an openly queer man running for public office. He cannot run on extreme left-wing values, otherwise it's a lost cause and pointless to run. Milk was smart to run on center-left values because that's what got him to win. No matter how you look at it, queer is political. It was made political when queer people were refused the right to marry. It was made political when queer people were beaten in the street because they loved someone of the same sex and gender. It was made political when the government refused to help people dying because it affected a minority that was frowned upon. Having a queer person in office allows for the exposure of queer rights issues and creates a platform to express the needs for change. Although he only served 11 months, his work and implementations have helped so many people in the San Francisco area. Harvey's historic win helped lay a path down for other queer officials like Anne Cronenberg. Milk was a gateway person to help queer the political audience.
I considered him my friend, my mentor, really a father figure as well.
Hello, my name is Chloe and welcome to my presentation for Queer Studies. For our group topic, we wanted to focus on lesbian activists and feminists during the AIDS crisis. Basically, like, what were they doing at the time? Since the AIDS crisis primarily focused on gay men, but we'll get to that. What I'm also going to briefly talk about is the effects on the LGBTQ community. And then a theme that I will be mentioning later is going to be about straight washing, a film that was straight washed, but much needed, and a film we watched in class called Brokeback Mountain. All right, well, let's begin. So let's first start out with this. What is HIV and AIDS? HIV is a human immune deficiency virus. It basically attacks cells that help the body fight infection. If left untreated, it can lead to AIDS. So AIDS is the last stage of HIV in which the body immune system is severely damaged. With that being said, how did HIV and AIDS impact the LGBTQ community? Well, it changed everyone's perspective on the LGBTQ community. Due to the lack of medical knowledge and about the causes or transmission methods of the disease, they did not know what to call it. They did not know what it was. But since it primarily affected gay men, it was initially assumed
that gay men were the only carriers. With that being said, it was known as the gay cancer. New York Times even wrote an article saying it was a rare cancer seen in 41 homosexuals. Not the title I would prefer. So the media really portrayed it against gay men, and also it was viewed as immoral, unethical. They believed that if you got HIV or AIDS, you were either a prostitute, you were gay, or you were a drug addict. And then during that time too, we had our leaders who didn't really speak out about AIDS in public, which we get silence equals death. President Ronald Reagan avoided mentioning the crisis in public altogether until a certain time, I believe it was 1989. He wanted to silence it because one, it was a pandemic. It was viewed as unethical, and there were people that President Ronald Reagan worked with and said, well, we probably shouldn't talk about it or do anything about it because we're killing off the right people. And so that's how it impacted the LGBTQ community. But what I really want to talk about is, you know, when you think of AIDS and you think of the HIV, what is something that comes up in your head? Is it gay men? I mean, to be honest, that's what it's like for me. When someone mentions AIDS, I always think of, oh, Freddie Mercury from Queen. He died of complications because he had AIDS. And so, but never people really think, well, what about women? What about the lesbians in the LGBTQ plus community? What were they doing? Where were they at? Did they get AIDS? So, lesbians were still prone to AIDS. However, studies shows that women cope better than males. Were there as many as gay men? No. But lesbians still, got AIDS. And those who didn't, they were fighting for this pandemic. It was actually said that in the 80s that gay men were not the kindest to lesbians. And they would call them butch dykes in the bars. They'd make fun of them. However, as soon as the AIDS pandemic happened, lesbians were the first one standing next to them. And so a bunch of these lesbians, they became activists and they worked alongside of gay male leaders to bring forth AIDS and research to the public. They wanted to make it known. That way, if they make it known, they make it to the public, like there is going to be a solution to this crisis. They were also taking on the role as nurses. When doctors were scared to go into the room, lesbians were like, "Get out of the way, I'll do it." And those who weren't, registered nurses, medical assistants, there was a lot of volunteers, a lot of lesbian volunteers. And because men with HIV could not donate blood, the women took care of that for them. So they donated a lot of blood. They volunteered. There's a lot of nurses that stepped forward when doctors couldn't, and a bunch of those were lesbians. And all of these male survivors of HIV, they would be interviewed and say, you know what, I used to make fun of them, but they were holding my hand in the room, in the waiting room, in their hospital bed. So, the lesbians were there. They were hidden, but I believe that they should get more credit. They did a lot of work for a group of men who were mean to them. And I think that is amazing. With that being said, I do want to mention one of the females and lesbians. Her name was Cynthia Carter. She was a lesbian color and an AIDS activist who gathered women in the 1980s to help fight the spread of this disease. She organized a major conference about AIDS in Washington, D.C. She also led a program where she spoke about this illness to incarcerated people. Later down the line, she was appointed a health coordinator, where she was the director of a program that talked about AIDS and HIV to children, teens, and women. So, with that being said, because this was a queer studies and film class, I did want to incorporate one of the films that we watched and kind of talk about queer cinema a little bit and how we're going from AIDS to queer cinema. So, the distraught from the AIDS epidemic and furious over how the president Ronald Reagan, handled this. He neglected, and then the whole media, how it portrayed it as like a gay illness. Queer filmmakers in the U.S. kind of took advantage of this outcome to basically express themselves and claim visibility. Bad times make great art. So the AIDS crisis incited the new queer cinema. So the new queer cinema was coined the label just right after the AIDS crisis. Films came out like Poison, Swoon, and Frisk. So eventually, going down the line, going into the 90s, early 90s, late 90s, this new queer cinema began to stabilize because the LGBTQ community became more mainstream. So when we started to become more mainstream, we're kind of on this verge of, is this queer cinema good enough? Or are we, it was like a little wishy-washy area. However, I think Brokeback Mountain kind of set the fine line of when talking about new queer cinema and introducing queer cinema and how it's going to affect the audience, gay or straight. Brokeback Mountain was, quote, queer film done straight. And what that kind of means is the director, Ang Lee, through his ability to balance and preserve both the power of queer content and the integrity of straight narrative styles, he incorporated a film that, yes, it was straight washed, definitely, but it draws a fine line to the queer audience in a way that the queer love and what comes with being gay felt authentic. Because, if you were to ask people, oh, have you watched Watermelon Woman or XXY? The answer is probably no. However, if you were to ask someone, oh, have you watched Brokeback Mountain? Majority of the people are going to say yes. So Brokeback Mountain did hit the billboards with drawing in about $178 million. But what I want to talk about is because that is that fine line that it drew. And, when we're talking about straight wash film, like you have to be careful as a director. You want to go so far to please the mainstream audience, but you also don't want to erase the queerness. However, Brokeback Mountain, in the movie, it moved away from AIDS, unlike the Tom Hanks movie produced before that. And moving it away from AIDS was just what the media needed. It's what the audience needed. Brokeback Mountain was produced in the midst of social change. We just came back from the 80s and 90s that were dominated by the AIDS pandemic. So when Brokeback Mountain came out, it was a film that showed the audience, both straight and gay, hey, like we're ready for more LGBTQ films. So I was excited to watch Brokeback Mountain again. Yes, I have watched it in my past, but just to see how AIDS inside of this new queer cinema, the new queer cinema became mainstream, and then boom, Brokeback Mountain came out, and it was just a film that touched everyone, gay and straight. Yes, it was whitewashed, but at the same time, the queer content felt authentic. So to summarize everything, lesbians were volunteers and they were leaders during the AIDS crisis. And we thank people for Cynthia Carter for standing up and making AIDS information available to the public so that she could protect others, not others that are not only gay, but straight. And then just to see how LGBTQ community was affected by that, but also it was better towards the end. And as well with new queer cinema and how it became mainstreamed. And this is where we are today.
Hello, my name is Ashley Moreno, and today I'm going to be talking about Joan Baker and her importance during the AIDS crisis. Okay, so imagine being a 20-year-old lesbian woman during the AIDS crisis in 1986. You had just agreed to accompany a friend of yours to go get tested for HIV. The results come in, and bam, turns out you're HIV positive. This was just the beginning of Joan's fight for her life during the AIDS crisis. Okay, so who is Joan Baker? Joan Baker, born on October 25th, 1966, in Riverside, California. Baker's family moved around a lot, eventually settling in England, as her family is from the United Kingdom. But that was until she came out as a lesbian and moved out in 1986 and ended up in San Francisco, California. Joan just had begun living her life there and had a girlfriend she had just moved in with before she tested positive. Joan, with an open heart and scared mind, shared the news with her girlfriend, who ended up breaking up with her and kicking her out of their apartment. Joan was considered homeless for a while until she was able to move into the famous Ambassador Hotel in San Francisco, which was considered a queer-friendly housing, of course. It was there she met Jackie Hansen, who was a community health outreach worker. Jackie basically helps find organizations and programs for people with AIDS and HIV. Hansen introduced Baker to the San Francisco AIDS Foundation, and that is where she attended the first women with AIDS support group. It was here that Baker accidentally became an icon during the AIDS crisis. The crazy part of it all was that Baker never intended to become this HIV activist, but she did it because she needed help. She needed the tools to help her fight this crisis, and in order to do that, she needed to make her presence known to the public. Joan began talking on shows, would promote many care organizations, join protests organized by AIDS Action Pledge and ACT UP San Francisco. She even had the honor to read off some of the names on the AIDS quilt in 1988 at the Gay and Lesbian March on Washington. These names were the men and women whose lives were lost during the crisis. I'd like to take a moment just to look at some of these names on the quilt. You can see their names and the year that their lives were lost. What I really like about all these quilts is that they're all different and they all represent something about that person, whether it's from where they're from or the hobbies they like during that time. And I just love that all of them are different and they're all represented in their own different way. So moving on, as open as Baker was about her fight for her life, being HIV positive, that didn't raise the stigma of HIV. The public and the media didn't help either. Rather than asking questions on how to cure it, they would interrogate men and women on how they got it. The media and world made it all about how these people would get it, assuming it was only a danger for gay people or drug users. Baker could tell how people felt about her when she would go public about it. They would assume that she was either gay or sticking a needle in her arm. Baker would shut it all down, quoting, "It doesn't matter how I got it. It's the fact that I have been diagnosed and I'm coming out as a woman with AIDS because a lot of lesbians think they can't get AIDS, but I'm here to say it can happen." Sadly, Baker died at the age of 27 on September 3rd, 1993. She was honored with a political funeral at the Dolores Park in San Francisco, California. It was at her funeral that many organizations who fought for the cause united. Some of those organizations included the Lesbian Avengers, ACT UP San Francisco, and even people from the Public Health Department. It was a full-on rally. Both gay and straight people attended, holding up pictures of Joan Baker. This was one of the pictures. It's been 28 years since her passing, and it's amazing how her story is barely getting the attention it so rightfully deserves. Women and lesbians with HIV during Baker's time were considered invisible. She didn't want that and wanted to make her story known as she can help people like herself know that they aren't alone, and that's what she did. Moving on to the stigma people with HIV go through every day. Almost 42 years later, some things never change. HIV still doesn't have the attention it needs. Some of the typical stigmas are, oh, you have HIV, you must be gay, or a prostitute, or you must be on drugs. However, that's not the case. Let's watch this short video about the stigma on HIV today.
After my diagnosis, I knew very well about the stigma associated with HIV. I definitely wanted support from everyone that I cared about, and all my friends and family and everyone around me. And I thought that if I disclosed this information to them, they would either reject me or make fun of me or judge me.
Most of the stigma that I experienced was self-inflicted. I think a lot of times people, when they're diagnosed HIV positive, they don't realize that they tell themselves to be ashamed, to be afraid, to feel disappointed in themselves because they were diagnosed HIV positive.
It's mind-boggling. It's terrifying. It's scary. You don't know where to go, who to turn to, all those thoughts that I mentioned that are running through your head, and they're different for every person.
My first thought was, now will anybody love me? After the diagnosis happened, I didn't know much about it, but I just knew that it would be a difficult situation in dating. How do I disclose this to someone?
Automatically, if you disclose your status, somebody thought that you've been on drugs or a prostitute or living a certain type of life.
Because there is a lot of different misinformation, miseducation, we have that stigma that affects people. And so there are still instances that people might not be comfortable hugging or holding hands or going on dates or sipping your cup of water. To be differentiated in that way is a painful experience. They may be completely ignorant to the fact that they're treating me somehow differently. But I try to look back on those instances as teachable moments. If I can impart them with that knowledge, then they might go through their life and explain it to somebody else.
Once I learned that I'm no different than what I was before my diagnosis, I think I began to love on myself even more.
Alrighty. Excuse me. Alrighty. So I wanted to talk about a couple things that some of those people said in that video. What really got to me the most was the fact that one of the gentlemen said that asked himself, will anybody ever love me? And I think that really hit me in a different way because for some reason I kept thinking that's probably how a lot of these people during the AIDS crisis, whether man, woman, felt. I think that was one of the big questions, is that they felt like they couldn't be loved because of what they had. Um, and I wanted to relate that a lot of those stigmas that they talked about, um, with AIDS, with the film XXY. The media during the AIDS crisis make people with HIV look like monsters, and they feel scared and confused and felt like no one can really understand them. So that's similar to the way Alex felt in the movie XXY. Alex, who was an intersex, and for those who don't know what that is, it's when someone is born with both male and female reproductive systems. Confused and emotional, because there wasn't much information about people who were intersex. Just like the AIDS crisis, no one knew what it was, which caused fear and confusion. All in all, people living with HIV, like Joan Baker did, and people who are intersex still have that negative stigma because people just don't understand. They're considered freaks, and I feel like it's time to change that stigma.